Hi, Grandma here, and we are reading Crispin by Avi. Before I get started on chapter 3, let's review the plot a little bit. What is the problem that Iasta's son has? And what has happened that has made the problem even worse, has created tension that we need some solutions for? Okay, the first thing that happened is his mother died, and he has no father, he has no other relatives, and they have no friends excepting the priest. So that is the problem. What has created added tension is the steward's attitude toward him. First, he demands the ox that he has, that he needs in order to plow the fields. Then he attacks him or tries to attack him. There's obviously a problem here that Aelcliff has with Asta's son. So we only have 3 characters so far: Asta's son, Father Quibble, and Aelcliff. Okay, chapter 3. That life of mine began on the feast of St. Giles in the year of our Lord, 1363, the 36th year of the reign of Edward III, England's great warrior king. We resided in Stromfield village with its 150 souls. Now, what the author has done here is he has established some facts that he hadn't told you in the first 2 chapters. We now know how old Asta's son is. He was born on September 1st, 1363, and it also has told us a little bit about the setting, that he lives in a village with only 150 people. We could do the math and find out that he is 13 years old. For as long as I could recall, my mother had simply called me son. And since her name was Asta, Asta's son became my common name. In a world in which one lived by the light of a father's name and rank, that meant since I had no father, I existed in a shadow. But he, like so many, had died before my birth during a recurrence of the great mortality, often called the plague. Or so my mother had informed me. She rarely mentioned him. Nor did she ever take another husband, a circumstance I did not question. It would have been a rare man who would want so frail and impoverished a woman for a wife. For in the entire kingdom of England, there could have been no poorer Christian soul than my mother and I. I had few friends, and none I completely trusted. As Asta's son, I was oft the butt of jests, jibes, and relentless hounding. Jests, jibes, and relentless hounding means he was made fun of. He was bullied by other people. Why do they taunt me so? I once asked Father Quinnell during one of my confessions. These confessions were numerous, since I had become convinced that it was some sin embedded in me, a sin I was desperate to root out. Be accepting, was the priest's advice. Think how our blessed Christ was taunted on his cross. I did try to accept my life, but unlike our perfect Jesus, I was filled with caution and suspicion, always expecting to be set upon or mocked. In short, I lived the life of the shunned, forever cast aside, yet looking on, curious at how others lived. There was little my mother or I could do about our plight. We were not slaves, but neither were we free. The steward, John Aelcliff, never lost an opportunity to remind us of the fact that we were villains, serfs, bound to Furnival, Lord of Stromfield village. Now, the difference between slaves and serfs. Slaves can be bought and sold by their owner, but the serfs belonged to the land and to whoever ruled the land. So they couldn't be bought and sold unless the land itself was bought and sold. Yet the Lord Furnival had fought in France or had been off to mercenary wars for so many years that most villagers, including myself, had never set eyes on him. It did not matter. Spring, summer, fall, save certain holy days, my mother and I, like every other Stromfield villager, worked his fields from dawn to dusk. When winter came, we fed the animals. We had an ox, and now and then a chicken, gathered wood and brush for heat, slept and tried to stay alive. At a time when bread cost a quarter penny a loaf, the value of my mother's daily labor, by King Edward's royal decree, was a penny each day. Mine but a farthing. Our food was barley bread, watered ale, and from time to time some cooked dried peas. If good fortune blessed us, there might be a little meat at Christmas time. Thus our lives never changed, but went round the rolling years beneath the starry vault of distant heaven. Time was the great millstone which ground us to dust like kerneled wheat. The Holy Church told us where we were in the alterations of the day, the year, and in our daily toil. Birth and death alone gave distinction to our lives as we made the journey between the darkness whence we had come to the darkness where we were fated to wait Judgment Day. Then God's terrible gaze would fall on us all and lift us to heaven's bliss, or throw us down to the ever-blasting flames of hell. This was the life we led. It was no doubt the life my forefathers had led, as had all men and women since the days of Adam. With all my heart, I believed that we would continue to live the same until Archangel Gabriel announced the end of time. And with my mother's death, it was as if that time had come. Chapter 4. Following my escape from John Aycliffe and my night in the forest, it was the sound of a tolling bell that woke me. Dawn had come, and the Stromford Church was announcing early morning prayers, called Prime. In haste, I made the sign of the cross over my heart, offered up my daily prayer, and listened closely. All I heard was the sound of the bell and muted forest babble, nothing to alarm me. Once awake, however, I could only think of what I'd seen the night before, the meeting in the woods of the steward and the stranger, nor could I remove from my mind the steward's hateful look when he brought down his sword with a clear intent of killing me. Even so, I tried to convince myself that it would not matter. In the past, Aycliffe had treated me badly. His attack on me that night before was not the great exception. Why should he, I told myself, be concerned that I, a nobody, had seen him in this forest meeting? It seemed my best course of action would be to return to my home and act as though nothing untoward had occurred. With the coming of morning's light, it took little to determine where I was. I made my way toward the village. Since my mother had been a Catar, one who held no land in her own right, she and I lived in a rented one-room dwelling that stood at the far edge of our village by the northern boundary cross. A thin thatch roof kept out most rain. Earth was our floor, and since it was at some distance from the village, I was able to remain hidden from those who had gone to their daily labor. I was just about to emerge from the woods and run toward our hut when I caught sight of the bailiff, Roger Kinsworthy, and the reeve, Odo Langland. Not only were they carrying pikes and axes, they were headed for my cottage. Okay, a bailiff is a person who collects the taxes and the rent on houses. And the reeve is another person that's like the steward. He manages estates. Unsettled, I drew back quickly and concealed myself behind some bushes to observe their intentions as they entered our small building. Perhaps they were looking for me because they emerged in moments. But then, to my great shock, they began to use their tools to pull the structure down. The cottage, being of small, mean construction, could not withstand their assault. Within moments, it was little more than a heap of thatch, wattle, and clay. Not content with that, Kemsworthy produced a flint from his wallet, struck sparks, and set ablaze the place I had called my home for 13 years. Deeply shaken, I fled back to the forest as I went. I kept asking myself why they should have done such a thing. I could not believe it was merely because I'd seen the steward in the forest the night before. Once within the woods, I decided to go to a high rock which stood near the forest edge and overlook our village. Though the rock was difficult to climb, I'd done so before on one of my solitary rambles. It was to be hoped that I'd see something to help me understand what was happening. It was not, however, till mid-morning, which I knew by the positioning of the sun and the ringing of the church bell proclaiming terce, that I reached the rock. And terce is the third bell of the day, starting at 6 a.m. That would be, and it was basically 9 in the morning. People at that time didn't have watches and they didn't have clocks. The church probably had a clock in order to keep time, but they used where the sun was in the sky for most of their time telling, and they did have sundials to help them when the sun was out. So the people of the village depended upon the church to let them know what time it was, and that was the sounding of the bells. Once having made sure I was alone, I climbed. While the rock was not an easy ascent, at some places it was less than a cliff, I reached the pinnacle. Once there, I took the further precaution of lying down. Only then did I lift my head and look about. Before me, like some rolled-out tapestry, was my entire world. Beneath, the sky as blue as Our Lady's blessed robes, a contrast to the greening spring that lay abundant everywhere. Overhead, swallows flitted, free as birds ever are. To the west meandered the river Strom. Now that's where the village got their name, the river Strom. If you remember, the name of the village is Stromford Village. Stromford Village. Okay, at this point, the river ran at a shallow depth. Like most, I could not swim, but for much of the year, one could wade across. Above and below this ford, depending on the season, the water ran quite deep. Okay, so they live at a place in the river where you can cross the river safely. It's still underwater, but the water is very shallow, and that is called a ford. So anytime you see a town that has the name Ford in it, chances are it's by a river someplace. Okay, so Stromford Village is by this ford. Above and below the ford, depending on the season, the water ran quite deep. A few paces from the river's bank on the village side stood one of the stone crosses that marked Stromford's western limit. Covered by mystic markings, this cross had been erected when St. Giles had once appeared. So St. Giles apparently has been in that village, and that is his birthday. Asta's son's birthday is on the same day as St. Giles. So I imagine they have quite a celebration on that day. There on the river's low, tree-lined bank stood our noble's house, Lord Furnival's mansion, the grandest house I knew. It was where the steward had lived for many years in the absence of the knight. With stone walls 2 levels high and small windows, the manor was to me like a castle, high, mighty, and impenetrable. Inside, I had never been allowed to enter, but I had been told was an arched hall with a long trestle table and benches, several sleeping rooms, and a chapel. On the walls hung pictures of saints, along with ancient battle shields. The lower level was a large storage place for the wheat and food that the village produced. Opposite the manor house, across the road, was the mill. Smaller than Lord Furnivall's dwelling, it was built of stout timbers with grinding wheels of massive stone. These wheels were turned by river water, delivered by a run, which is like a divergence of the river, a little stream. Not only did the mill grind our wheat and barley at a cost, it contained the ovens where we villagers, by the steward's decree, baked our bread, which required another fee. A road led from the riverbank. Once a traveler had crossed the river, a road led east and reached another road that ran north and south. Where these roads met, our stone church, St. Giles by the river, stood with its ancient bell. Above and below the church were our dwelling places, some 40 cottages and huts of wattle and daub, thatch and wood, dirt and mud, all in varying shades of brown. Wattle and daub. Wattle is it's reeds, grasses that have been woven together and attached to a frame. And the daub is mud. It could be excrement, it's water, and it's mixed in, and it is spread on this mat of grass and reed. And when it dries, then it forms a wall. It's very common in Native American houses as well. And I was reading up on it, and in St. Genevieve, Missouri, which is near where I live in St. Louis, they have some examples of it done by the French in their construction of early housing in the early 1700s, late 1600s. Okay, moving on. North of the village was the commons, where we peasants grazed our own oxen and sheep. Here, too, were the archery butts, where men of age were required by King Edward's decree to practice every Sunday. It was also the place where the public stocks and gallows stood. The land for growing crops was laid out in long, narrow strips. One of 3 strips was planted with barley, another wheat. The final third lay fallow for the grazing of the manor's cattle. As for the 2 roads that passed through Stromford, all I knew was that they led to the rest of England, of which I had no knowledge. And beyond England, I suppose, came the remaining world, a great Christendom, our priest called it. But in all my life, I'd never gone past the boundary crosses, which marked the limits of our village. Everything from the woods, the cottages, the manor house, the mill, the roads, the growing lands, the commons, even the church itself, to the tiny crofts behind our cottage used for planting herbs and roots, everything belonged to Lord Furnivall, who held it in the king's name. Indeed, the steward said we belonged to our lord as well. Like all villagers, we were required to ask the steward's permission to be excused from work if ill, to grind our wheat, to bake it, to buy it, sell, to travel from our parish, to marry, even to baptize our children. In return, we gained 2 things. When we died, there was hope for heaven. And Lord Furnivall protected us from the Scots, the French, the Danes, and the wicked infidels. But that morning I had little doubt I'd never be protected again. Chapter 5. As I gazed from the high rock, all seemed calm and completely normal. Men, women, and children were in the fields at their lawful labor, plowing, weeding, sowing where they could remain till dusk. But as I watched, I saw 2 horses with riders emerge from the manor house. By the way one of the riders sat, not well, I was sure it was John Aycliffe, the steward. The other man, I suppose, was the one I'd seen him with the night before. The 2 men rode slowly to the church, dismounted, and then went inside. I waited. The church bell began to ring. It was not the slow, rhythmic pealing that announced the canonical hours, but a strident, urgent clamor, a call to important news. In the fields, people stopped their work and looked about. Within moments, they began to walk toward the church. Others emerged from cottages. It did not take long before the entire village was assembled in the front of the church porch. Once all had gathered, the bell ceased to ring. 3 men stepped from the church. The first to come was the steward, then the stranger. The last was Father Quinnell, whom I recognized because old age had marked him with a stoop. The trio placed themselves before the doors of the church, where the steward briefly addressed the crowd. Then the stranger held forth at greater length. Finally, Father Quinnell spoke. Then, followed by the steward and the stranger, as well as all the villagers, he led the way back into the church. The church bell now began to toll again, as if a mass were announced, but for whom or what purpose I could not guess. I was tempted to go forward, but my apprehension, greatly increased by the destruction of my home, kept me back. Instead, I bowed my head in prayer. O great and giving Jesus, I who have no name, who am nothing, who do not know what to do, who am all alone in the world, I am full of sin. I implore thy blessed help, or I'm undone. Well, we're going to stop here before chapter 6. And this chapter leaves a lot of questions like, what in the world do you think they announced from the church? Do you think Asta's son was correct in not going when the church bells ring? Don't you feel sorry for him all alone? I do. I do. Anyway, see you later. Bye-bye.